It's great to see you, to be with you. Anything we share this is a conversation. It's meant to give and take. It's meant to explore on this. My biggest exploration has been in my ministry of always wondering in evangelism, when I think about it, am I really connecting with people? Or even myself. There's always been a lack of relational intimacy. And that's one of the things that's probably even led in God's calling from an established church into the work of church planting. I'm on a mission to restore relational intimacy to evangelism, at least in my journey. And it all does really and truly start by simply paying attention to the dear person in front of you and listening to their stories in order to tap in, to recognize and hear the image of God speaking in somebody's life. To hear and to lovingly hold the image of God. It might be grief, it might be a cherished love, but when we hear and hold somebody's dignity, however tattered it might look and feel, it has a way of honoring that person and shepherding their heart ultimately before the presence of the Father. That is the holy priesthood role of believers in this world. It is another word for it that we can use is a confessor. It's really displaying God's love in a way that reflects our great high priest Jesus, the way he bears others' burdens and hearts. But this didn't really come alive to me until I strangely bumped into an old 5th century friend named St. Augustine in the midst of hearing the stories behind a friend's tattoo. And I'll fill this in for you. I'm going to call her Melissa. Her husband was coming to faith in Jesus right before my eyes. But she was really clear. With me, with him, I will always be allergic to religion and to Christianity. And I'm not going to be able to cover that up. Jesus, he might be a useful mythology, but he better not oppress me. And that's just where we are. And then I asked a question that apparently had never been asked of her before. I said, would you mind sharing me the story behind your tattoos? I don't think I was prepared by how grateful she was for the invitation. She has never articulated some of these stories. And she sensed that we should have this conversation. And we had many conversations. On her arms featured Hindu images, kind of reflecting a turn towards Eastern religion. One was of the god Ganesha, usually the elephant head and the four arms. It's a god of new beginnings. It's particularly a god who removes obstacles. And that resonated with her so much that she put it permanently on her arm. Obstacles. She began to share with me growing up in a church, in a Christian home. But many key people in her life had really profoundly disappointed her. And there was an ensuing disconnect with Christianity, not feeling at home with Christianity, not feeling at home with family relationships, not feeling at home in her own body, and the southern stereotypes of femininity. So the stories continue. The tattoos were much reflected different directions she had taken with sexual identity, gender, dealing with abuse in life. And admittedly, different places where she had gone were dissatisfying to her. And as I was listening to this, it reminded me of my own spiritual journeys and the different places that I had gone to try to build whoever I thought I was. And past hurts and depressions. And that's all of a sudden it hit me. I've heard this before another way too. And I remembered reading for the first time St. Augustine's Confessions. A restless soul that's traveling and travailing through sexual addiction, philosophical pursuits, fame pursuits, restless until he finally finds his rest in Jesus Christ. And as I'm listening, this question began to emerge. Are these the places that you've journeyed to make sense of who you are? Are these the places that you've gone that was trying to make sense of that pain? Or are these the places you've gone to make sense of your wanting to be home? And there was silence, and there were these painfully beautiful tears that welled up. And if you look into those tears, it's like a magnifying glass to something very beautiful of the image of God. And as we did that, at that moment, both of us were on this sacred space together of connection, of trust. And I'm a guest on that space, and I know it. And I treat it like that. It's holy ground. What happens when we slow down and play the role of listening in order to recognize and find out? Here's the first thing that I think is just really important that I've discovered, and I've already said it. Listening to hear and playing the role of the confessor, hearing the stories, it creates a sacred space of honor for the image of God, of honor for somebody's dignity. You know, Augustine's goal in the 5th century was to hold forth the Christian faith in a very pluralistic world that was raging while the Roman Empire was falling apart. That should sound kind of familiar. But here's the deal. I mean, he does a lot of different things, different writings, but he doesn't just go culture war on everybody. He doesn't pull his, serape back with the, Clint Eastwood style. Here's what he does. He writes a spiritual autobiography of introspection. And he begins to tell a story. And as he does that, he is inviting the reader into that same journey because he knows it is the same journey. And I don't have the time to reel off lots of quotes, but as you read, as you hear him talk about grief of losing his best friend, or talk about being caged with his passions, the reader is supposed to say, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. He's trying to tap into the reader's humanity, the reader's image of God, so that you can say, okay, now you go next. The act of telling, the act of hearing creates a space. So what does it mean to hear and to hold? It is to be able and to learn, to discover and recognize and honor some aspect of the image of God. Paul did that. Hey, Athenians, your worship, your idol worship. There's something good about that idol worship. That's how he starts it off. Sounds horrible, doesn't it? No, he was tapping into the image of God. If somebody goes there and you're in a sacred space, if I were to use that space of vulnerability to manipulate, to make a deal for Jesus. You know what happened, that sacred space? It's profaned. And you might not get called out verbally, but the connection is not good anymore. But if I sit there and appreciate the space, not only for that dear friend, but even for my own soul, and just sit there with it and appreciate and kind of breathe in that space, great things happen. I'm convinced, more than ever, that gospel ministry must be tailored to individuals. Are there ways to summarize the gospel? Absolutely. But it's got to be tailored, and it's more fascinating than ever before because of that. But that's the first step for me. In many conversations, but I'm going to keep going back to my friend Melissa. If I'm going to honor that person for the sake of Jesus and be the confessor that creates that space to be able to listen and hear where the image of God is received and recognized and affirmed, the confessor must become a fellow confessee. And let me tell you what I mean by that. I'll go with Augustine first. When you read Augustine, as he shares his wanderings and his own longing for intimacy and truth, even a skeptical reader is going to be drawn in precisely because when Augustine shares, you know that he's laying his own heart on the line. He has skin in the game. So what does that mean for evangelism? If you're really hearing and holding the traumas or the longings or the passions of a friend in your life and right in front of you, you cannot assume a superior position, the let me tell you how person, the answer person. I was the answer person for a long time in ministry. It's really exhausting. But if you realize that you have as much to lose and to gain, and you have as much passion and as much pain as the person in front of you in different degrees, and you sit in there with them, if you give somebody space to lament and give somebody to process life, then you're on the same level. You're in joint discovery. And guess what? You'll be called on to confess, to share your own stories, your own intimacy disorders as appropriate. But the thing is, you're both processing, and you're giving the other person the honor to discover for themselves. You're putting yourself right there, and you're wrestling with each other. The kind of, I won't let you go until you bless me kind of wrestling. I'm not waging warfare against somebody. We're actually contending for each other. We've gone from hearing to holding to what I call harnessing each other. And here is my surprise discovery. Honoring the person in front of you is to lay down any urges to steer the conversation or to make a gospel move. And there's a difference between making an appeal for the gospel as a front stager or a closer of the deal and making a gospel appeal with your own soul on the line. And usually, here's what it looks like. And here's what sharing your story is. It's less about using first person. I, here's what I've done, here's how I've, and more about using the third person. He had mercy on me. is to look a friend in the eye and value him or her to take ownership and processing what is ultimately the grace and truth of the gospel. Because what's really happening, this is the third thing. It creates the sacred space to honor the image of God, but the confessor, in doing that, he's got to put himself in there too. Or she has to put herself in there too. But you find out the whole time that there's a third party. The only reason that hearing and holding, hearing the image of God, giving it a space, dear friend, the space to process their heart, the only reason why that works is if there is one who truly hears and truly holds, and that is our great high priest Jesus, who is there, whether we realize or recognize him or not. This is the linchpin of evangelism, I think. It's actually the linchpin of Augustine's Confessions, by the way. He's really addressed not to the reader. Who's he addressing the whole time? If you've read him, he's actually talking to God the whole time in ways that you kind of forget and then remember. And this is what's great about this. We need, in our day, story is important. But sometimes it's so important that it seems to trump everything else. How do you get out of merely somebody's story? Well, guess what? When you make way for the great high priest, the role of confessor is Christward. A Christian and a non-Christian are beholding and processing together the beauty and the glory of God before the one who is there. Once in a while back, having dinner on our back patio, my friend Melissa begins to say, I feel like I might be coming back full circle to this Jesus. Because I feel like I've been at home for the first time since I'm a childhood, but it scares the hell out of me. And I can't keep my fear covered. I don't know if I can buy into this or not, but I want to if it's true. Now, I want to first look at you and say it again. How can we be sure that Jesus works through hearing and holding? It's because when you play that holy priesthood role of a confessor, you're also the confessee before the true confessor. And you know why? Because that true great high priest, the true confessor, what he did, he became the confessee. He truly hears and holds before the Father. He sends his Spirit and we can embody him. So here is the kind of the conversation has gone, and I've turned it into a faith letter. Melissa, I cannot tell you how privileged and grateful I am for you and your heart for letting me into your life and story. I want you to know I am with you and I am for you. You shared so bravely what it is to just be fearful of being known and handled and held. Deep down, I think you're spot on. I think your fear is normal. That fear has been my life story. It's driven me and it's crippled me in many ways. Can I share something with you? On those days when my depression blankets me, when I only see through the lens of worthlessness, Jesus' words have washed over me. I'm your good shepherd. I do not hold my life over you until you can get it. I lay it down for you. And nothing, not even your worthless verdict, can snatch you from my hands of love. I am your home, your worth. I'm not going anywhere. That's been my joy. Can we meet again at Standard Coffee downtown? I'd love to know what you think about this. And I'll listen. Grace and peace, truly, Harris. Thank you.
Harris, thank you so much. That was fantastic. We have a time where I'm going to lead us in a Q&A. So if y'all have questions, please, you can raise your hands. We got someone who will run a microphone to you. I'm also online checking the YouTube, the live stream to see if there's questions there as well. So I wanted to, does anybody have any questions? Just go ahead and raise your hand. We'll get you a microphone.
Harris, thank you. I learned something. I'm curious about your unique emotional composition. How are you made emotionally? Could you give us an insight into that a little bit? Because you feel and channel things that I have to work pretty hard to get to. How are you built, my friend?
Well, I'm curious about my emotional makeup as well. And I don't think that ever has changed. I'd love to ask my wife the same question. This is nothing unique to me. The form might be. But, I have had throughout my life and in my childhood times which, looking back on it, don't seem like any big deal. Hurtful people. There's always bullies. There's always, the competition among boys that turns nasty. And I'm looking back on that now, thinking. But you know what? It's interesting how some of those voices stay with you and haunt you and shape you. And even every time you're going to do something that seems wonderful or significant, those voices get the loudest, and then you kind of back down. And so I've had insecurities. I've had aspects of some hard, very deeply hurtful moments in life. And I mentioned depression, right? And that's another part of it. I call it the worthlessness filter. So you could say, man, you did a great job with that. And somehow I'll turn it into, Harris, you're worthless. And it sounds so silly, saying it out loud. Well, I guess I'd like to think that there's something the way God has supervened. Is that a word? I don't know what I'm trying to say.
Sure it is.
He's really taken charge.
It is now.
It is now. And he uses that. I see that in other people. I recognize similar things. And it's like I'll gladly kind of stop what I'm doing to hear it. And somehow, not in a verbal way, that just kind of gets communicated. I've been told that, but I can see that might be true. And I think God does that with us. I think did that answer the question?
It does, yeah. I've got another question here. Harris, your faith letter that you read was such a beautiful and very particular, like an individualized sharing of the gospel. And I just want to ask you, how different does it feel to you to share the gospel in such a personal way versus having a canned presentation?
I've had a lot of experience in my life with different ways of sharing the gospel and equipping others to share the gospel, many of which they're not bad, but they are a presentation, a script, as it were. And nothing has felt dirtier to me. This is just me talking personally. I know God works through different ways, and I believe he has worked through me presenting in such a way that led to someone saying a prayer. And I think God has surprised me. I've seen God change people through certain presentations, but I've also been a part of leading somebody to pray to receive Jesus, in which case it may not have meant anything. And so this particular way, and it's not, again, this isn't, oh, let me connect with the image of God so I can then do this. That loses the whole thing too. But if God brings you together in a very focused way, and he brought not just that person, but me in that person, I don't take it for granted. And there's something, I'm sharing the gospel to myself. We're both doing it together. And it's like we're both breathing together. So it's kind of a mutual thing. So that is so wonderful. So I'm kind of switching into that direction as opposed to the mere presentation. But guess what? Those presentations help me in those situations too. So.
Good. Other questions? Well, I love what you said about when you hear someone, there's a sacred space that's created between the two of you, and what you just shared about being able to breathe together in that space. What kinds of things have you discovered about the gospel in that sacred space between you and someone else?
Well, number one, it never ceases to amaze me how much in common I have with most people. And that always surprises me. And if I have so much in common with other people, maybe in a negative way in terms of trials, then I realize that it's also the same Jesus has mercy on me too. I was with another girl, who was very suspicious of me as a church planter and as a pastor, and we were using a facility where she worked for our core group meetings, and over time, just sharing more and more of each other, and the suspicions. She would share things that were shocking, probably to test me out, and we began to have so much more in common. And this was a same homosexual or a lifestyle or not lifestyle merely, but I mean just world. And there was also a lot of horrible trauma being shared, of feeling ugly as a result of men. And instead of trying to explain that or try to defend or anything like that as a man, I needed to hear it. And at one point in a conversation, it says, "How can you understand this? Why?" I didn't say anything. But there was, and that actually led to actually talking about the beauty of how Christ comes to us in a beautifying way. And then as I did that, I realized I didn't believe I struggle with believing that myself. And so she was helping me to believe the gospel.
That's beautiful. I think one of the things that we learn is that when we hear well, that the hearing often does the heavy lifting. And sometimes hearing people is to make them feel cared for and loved. I feel like you said that the reason our hearing is effective is because it brings in the hearing of God. Like the God is really the one who hears. And do you feel like as a hearer, as a confessor, someone that is being confessed to, that in that role that you are being able to share the presence of God with people?
Absolutely. I'll give the footnote to that Becky Pippert book, the Salt Shaker, whatever, I can't think of the name, Out of the Salt Shaker. And she says, there's really three modes at play. And I forget her words, but there's proclaiming or speaking, declaring the gospel. There's displaying the gospel, and then demonstrating the gospel in the power of the Spirit. So there's proclaiming in truth, but there's displaying in love. And it's interesting that I've always found it helpful. If you don't embody what you declare, then you've erased it. And there's probably a great Becky Pippert quote in there. I can't think of one, but it really is. That's the truth. How often a lack of character erases anything that's said, and so that don't ever underestimate. So I think embodying in your presence in everything is just as important as anything that could ever be said as well. And we divorce the two all the time. That's how we do things in our culture. Let's restore intimacy back.
That's great. Y'all, let's give it up for Harris Bond. Thanks, Harris.
I learned from y'all, so thank you.